Final Fantasy II is widely regarded as the worst game in the series. In this video, I'm gonna explain why. In spite of all its flaws, it is actually the most important Final Fantasy game ever made. In this retrospective, I'll show you what the original version of Final Fantasy II was like, how it built upon and changed the formula established by the original Final Fantasy, and explain why this game should be celebrated as the soul of Final Fantasy. Welcome to Square's Bravest Moment. Before we get started, I have to clarify which Final Fantasy II I'm talking about. While the original Final Fantasy did get a Western release, the same is not true for Final Fantasy II or III. Instead, the next game to make it to the West was actually Final Fantasy IV. To avoid confusing Western fans of the original game, Final Fantasy IV was marketed in the West as Final Fantasy II. It made sense at the time, but today it's just annoying. This video is about the Japanese Final Fantasy II. This game has had several remakes over the years, but since this is a retrospective, I'll be looking at the original Famicom version from 1988. And since this game never got an official English translation, I'll be playing the 1998 fan translation by Demiforce. Final Fantasy II was released in Japan on December 17, 1988. Almost 1 year to the day from the release of the original Final Fantasy. At first glance, the two games can be hard to tell apart. The graphics are very similar, and the sequel even reused some of the assets from the previous game. But there are some differences. Towns and dungeons are more elaborate, shops and inns have interiors to explore, and the world map got a bit more flair, with animated oceans and airships zooming around the world. While the graphics may have failed to impress, the same cannot be said for the other half of the audiovisual presentation. Final Fantasy II's soundtrack is a big step forward. You'll still be listening to the same battle theme and town theme for most of the game, and the tunes do get tedious in the long run, but the music is just so much easier on the ears. And there's a couple of real gems here. Mysidian Tower, Castle Pandemonium, and of course the game's fantastic ending theme, which was eventually given a beautiful orchestral arrangement with lyrics as Love Will Grow. This song holds a special meaning for me personally, as it was one of the first songs I ever downloaded off the internet. The game also featured the first version of one of the most iconic Final Fantasy compositions, but we'll get to that later. For the most part, Final Fantasy II is a classic JRPG with a familiar gameplay loop. The player guides a party of 3 or 4 heroes on an epic quest that takes them across an entire world. This world is presented as a traditional overland map filled with forests, swamps, rivers, and mountains. The heroes explore this environment on foot, by ship or canoe, and eventually by airship. Traveling through the wilderness will trigger random encounters with monsters that must be dealt with, but towns and castles are spread throughout the world to provide the heroes with a place to rest, gather information, and purchase spells and equipment. Most of the game still takes place inside dungeons, which are filled with monsters and often feature a powerful boss encounter at the end. But this time around, there's quite a bit of variety to the game's dungeons. In Leviathan, the heroes explore the bowels of a gargantuan sea monster after their ship is swallowed. The Colosseum sees the heroes participating in the Emperor's twisted public games to win back Princess Hilda, and in Castle Fynn, the heroes liberate a city from the Empire. The coolest dungeon in the game is probably the Dreadnought, where the heroes infiltrate an enemy airship. There's some light stealth elements, an ally to rescue from the ship's brig, and a non-standard goal in sabotaging the Dreadnought's engine. There's even a plot twist at the end and an exciting resolution where the heroes escape the exploding airship at the last moment. It's all very impressive for its time. As the heroes explore the world and fight their way through dungeons, they grow stronger and get their hands on more powerful armor, weapons, and spells. This game also added a new feature which we now take for granted: item drops from monsters. Another new feature in Final Fantasy II is the keyword system. By talking to NPCs, the player can learn passwords and other important terms, which can then be used in conversation with other NPCs to unlock more information and progress the story. Which leads us to the first of 2 fundamental pillars of this game, and the one Final Fantasy II got right. Because this is where the series made its first real attempt at doing what Final Fantasy does best: telling a great story. Let me tell you a story of grand adventure. A story of a wicked empire and a tyrant whose dark ambitions threaten to plunge the world into chaos. This is a story of the heroes who gave their lives to stop him. It's a tale of war, rebellion, betrayal, and redemption. This is the story of Final Fantasy II. When the Emperor of Palamecia opens the gates to hell and calls forth an army of monsters to conquer the world, a rebellion rises in the kingdom of Fynn. The rebels fight valiantly, but they are no match for the Empire. Fynn falls, and the rebel army, led by Princess Hilda, retreats to the small town of Altair. 4 young citizens of Fynn, Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon, are orphaned by the Empire's invasion. As they escape the burning city, Imperial Knights strike them down and leave them for dead. But hope does not easily die. The rebels rescue the fallen friends and take them to Altair to be healed. Only when they wake up, Maria's brother Leon is nowhere to be found. Determined to find their missing friend and help defeat the Empire, the 3 young heroes set out on a quest that will take them to the ends of the earth and far beyond. Final Fantasy II was intended to be a more story-driven game than the first Final Fantasy, and it really shows. The game was miles ahead of its predecessor, and when you get into the business of writing story-driven games, it goes without saying that there's one thing you really truly need: a great cast of characters. The original Final Fantasy let the player create their own party of 4 heroes, but Final Fantasy was light on story and focused more on exploration and adventure. A story like Final Fantasy II's needed more than faceless avatars. It needed actual heroes. Firion, Maria, and Guy came with predetermined names, though you had to read the manual to know what they were, and the game let you name them whatever you wanted. But whatever you named them, they had a past, a personality, and their own little quirks. It was super basic, but it was there. Final Fantasy II's main characters weren't just wandering heroes of prophecy. They were intimately tied to the world and had a personal stake in the struggle against the Empire. They had bonds of love with each other as childhood friends. They had bonds of gratitude to the rebel leaders for saving their lives. And throughout the story, they form unshakable bonds with companions who are ready to die for them. These characters may be mostly forgotten these days, but they deserve to be remembered. Firion was Final Fantasy's very first protagonist, the first character to become the hero of his own story. Maria was the first female party member. She might not seem like much today, but in an era where women in video games were mostly damsels in distress, this was a pretty big deal. Final Fantasy II was also the first game to give us something fans of the Final Fantasy series came to expect during the golden era of Square: a love story. Firion and Maria is technically the first official Final Fantasy romance, although it's so subtle, if you blink you might miss it. But as big a step forward as the heroes were, it was another cast of characters that stole the show: the companions. Where the first Final Fantasy had only a handful of named non-player characters, the sequel was filled with them. More importantly, their roles went beyond simply providing information and key items to the heroes. Many of them had their own stories to tell. Even minor characters had a connection to the story and motivations behind their actions. During the fall of Castle Fynn, Prince Scott of Cashuan stayed behind to cover the rebel army's retreat because of his love for Princess Hilda. Cid was a former captain of Finn's White Knights whose passion for engineering led him to create the world's first airship. For the first time in the series, we also saw a deeper relationship between the game's heroes and its villain. The Emperor of Palamecia wasn't just some nefarious figure waiting in the shadows. The Emperor was personally responsible for the invasion of Fynn that orphaned the heroes, and he also showed up in person several times during the game. Well before the final confrontation in Pandemonium, the Emperor was an integral part of the story. But the true strength in the game's story lies in those characters who took the fight against the Empire one step further: the companions. Final Fantasy II was the first in the series to have a dynamic party, where characters would drop in and out depending on the stage of the story. There are a total of 5 companions that end up joining the heroes at different points in the story, and during their time on the main stage, they become fully fledged party members with the same potential for growth as the heroes. As I will show later, this system had its flaws, but in terms of the story, it was a masterstroke. The companions showed a great deal of variation, and they all had their own character arcs. Minu was an experienced white mage and the right-hand man of Princess Hilda, and took on a mentor role for the heroes. Later in the game, the heroes reunite with Minu in the Mysidian Tower, only for the white mage to surrender his life force, so that the seal on the Ultima Tome can be broken. The warrior monk Joseph initially refuses to help the heroes because his daughter is held hostage by the Empire. Later, Joseph accompanies the heroes to the Ice Cave to retrieve the goddess bell and sacrifices himself to save the heroes when the traitorous Count Borgen unleashes a death trap upon the party. The pirate captain Layla gives the heroes passage to the island of Deist, but ambushes them at sea with her crew. When the heroes spare her life, she agrees to join them in their fight, and eventually becomes one of the rebel army's fiercest supporters, even going so far as to aid the rebels in the liberation of Fynn. Richard Highwind is the last of the dragoons of Deist, and initially struggles with this knowledge after learning of the demise of his people. After accepting the truth, he becomes determined to resist the Empire, and in the end, he chooses to sacrifice himself so that the heroes may escape Castle Palamecia, even though it means the end of the dragoons. Prince Gordon of Kashuan begins the game as a cowardly man filled with self-loathing over leaving his brother to die during the fall of Fynn. Over the course of the game, he finds his courage, assists the heroes in recovering the Sunfire from Kashuan Keep, and eventually grows into a brave and confident leader of the rebel army, and wins the love of Princess Hilda. I said the game has 5 companions, but really it has 6. It's just that this 6th companion is both the game's 4th hero and its most compelling antagonist, Leon. Captured by the Empire during the fall of Fynn, Maria's brother Leon found his way into the Emperor's service. As the mysterious Dark Knight, he crossed paths with the heroes throughout the story, before his true identity was revealed towards the end of the game. The plot twist might seem cheesy and obvious to us now, but it would have been quite a twist in 1988. Final Fantasy II's characters were above and beyond for the time, but the characters weren't the only way the game's story showed depth and complexity. It was also in the way the story was told. Final Fantasy II's ambitions were clear from the start. The very first thing that happens in the game was an innovation. A groundbreaking storytelling device that's been copied so often it has become a trope. An unwinnable battle. The story opened in the middle of a confrontation between the heroes and a squad of Imperial Knights. This is a battle you cannot win, and it perfectly sets the stage for the game's story, visually and instinctively communicating the idea that the heroes are underdogs who do not stand a chance against the Empire. This setup is paid off beautifully when the heroes finally fight their way through pandemonium in the late stages of the game. Going head to head with the same types of enemies that once stomped you at the start of the game really does have the taste of triumph. But this was only the beginning. The game's story was full of twists and setbacks. The Dreadnought takes to the skies before the heroes can sabotage it, raining destruction down on the rebel strongholds. After the heroes claim the Sunfire from Kashuan Keep, Princess Hilda is captured by the Empire. Leviathan swallows the heroes' ship without warning as they approach the Mysidian Tower, and when the heroes emerge from the tower with the Ultima Tome in hand, the Emperor summons the Cyclone to devastate the world. Even after the heroes defeat the Emperor and seemingly end the war, their victory turns out to be a false one. The game is full of surprises and subverted expectations, and none of them are more ambitious than what happens in the throne room of Castle Palamecia. When the heroes confront their old friend Leon, players might have expected an epic boss fight. Instead, the Emperor returns from hell to turn everything on its head, and Richard gives his life to allow the heroes to retreat with Leon. Many plot points are also given proper foreshadowing. Kashuan Keep is mentioned several times before the heroes ever think about going there. The Dreadnought is among the first things the player learns about, and the Ultima Tome is spoken of throughout the game. The game also did a fantastic job of showing the threat posed by the Emperor. When the heroes fail to stop the Dreadnought from launching, its wake of destruction is illustrated in the towns they pass on their way back. And when the Emperor summons the Cyclone, several towns, including the rebel base at Altair, are utterly destroyed. The player witnessed firsthand the Empire's atrocities, adding a sense of urgency to the heroes' fight, and showing the terrible price that must be paid should they fail in their quest. In fact, this story was dark. So many characters died in this game. Later versions of Final Fantasy II added a bonus campaign where you play as the dead companions in the afterlife. For all of its ambition, the game's story also fell short in other ways. Conversations are brief and cutscenes extremely basic. When Joseph dies, there's no reaction from the heroes, not even a pause to say a few words. When Layla is separated from the party after the ship is swallowed by a Leviathan, only a single line is spoken. And Minhu's sacrifice at the Mysidian Tower can pretty much be boiled down to, "Hey guys, okay, I'm dead." The story also suffers from a lack of focus, and some of the plot points feel a bit random. Everyone makes such a big deal of Ultima, but it's never mentioned again after the heroes get it. Really? Come on guys. Minhu died for this. Actually, as cool as Ultima sounds, the spell that should have been at the top of the Mysidian Tower is the one with the least impressive name. Stick around for the very end of the video and I'll show you the awesome power of the game's true ultimate magic. Still, this was a great story for its time, and the fundamental ideas remain strong today. Final Fantasy II's story had a ton of potential, and if given an honest chance with modern storytelling techniques, it would set the world on fire. Sadly, Final Fantasy II isn't famous for its story, but for something else. This is the one part of the game that saw the most change from the original Final Fantasy, the leveling system. While traditional RPGs use experience points and levels to track a character's growth, Final Fantasy II introduced an activity-based progression system. If you've ever played Skyrim, you know how this works. The more you use a particular skill or attribute, the more it will grow. Swing a sword a lot and you'll get better at using swords. Cast fire a bunch of times and your fire spell will grow stronger. But Skyrim characters still gain levels. Final Fantasy II's characters do not. Instead, even basic attributes like strength, intelligence, and hit points are increased by using them. Attacking with weapons builds strength, casting black magic improves intelligence, and yeah, getting hit in the face raises your hit points. This progression system was as ambitious and original as the mind behind it. Akitoshi Kawatsu returned as director of battle systems, and for the sequel, he wanted to create something new and exciting. He wanted a system where rather than choosing who the characters were at the start of the game, the characters' identities would be defined by their actions throughout the story. In theory, this progression system sounds really cool. In reality, Final Fantasy II's progression system is precisely the reason why the game has such a bad reputation. That's because, as we're about to find out, in practice, the system had a lot of issues. At first glance, Final Fantasy II offers a world of possibilities in customizing your party. Any character can equip any weapon or armor and learn any combination of spells. The three heroes begin the game with slightly different starting attributes, but there's really nothing stopping you from taking any of them in whatever direction you want. It's also a relatively simple matter to change a character's specialization midway through the game. It's a fully modular system where any character can master any skill or spell and become whatever you want. And for someone who loves power leveling as much as I do, it sounds really fun. But interacting with the progression system is often more frustrating than it is fun. Trying to play the game on instinct alone will most likely result in a seriously underpowered party and a miserable experience. That's because progression in Final Fantasy II is dangerously close to what you call a zero-sum game. Increasing strength will decrease intelligence, increasing intelligence will decrease stamina, and increasing spirit will decrease strength. A character who uses black magic, which relies on the intelligence attribute, must avoid at all costs attacking with weapons. A fighter must steer clear of white magic and can just forget about using black magic. This negative relationship between attributes kills many otherwise promising character builds. All weapons rely on the strength attribute, so magic users should never attack. A character who specializes in white magic should spend every single round casting cure and other white magic spells, as doing literally anything else will damage their growth as a white mage. And since the game doesn't even have a defend command, your choices in battle are extremely limited. While in theory you could build any kind of character you want, the reality is that only a handful of options are viable. Really, what the game's design strongly encourages you to do is to pick one of 4 classes. fighter, white mage, black mage, and red mage. And even the red mage is kind of a bad idea because of the next problem, the magic system. In Final Fantasy II, any character can learn any spell, as long as you have access to the right tome. These can be bought in shops, found in treasure chests, or even dropped by enemies, which is really cool. But this game is missing one of the most iconic elements of Final Fantasy's magic. Something that's been featured in pretty much every mainline Final Fantasy. Advanced versions of the same spell, such as Cure, Cura, and Curaga. Instead, just like weapon skills, spells in Final Fantasy II have ranks that start at 1 and go all the way up to 16. A character that casts Cure often will increase their rank with the spell, and the higher the spell's rank, the more powerful it gets. Because leveling spell ranks is so time consuming, this magic system has an unfortunate side effect. You're strongly encouraged to focus each character's attention on a handful of spells at the most. Even worse, a character that uses both white and black magic will also split their attention between the intelligence and spirit attributes, with all of their spells ending up much weaker as a result. As if these factors weren't bad enough, characters who attempt a hybrid build must face a third problem. And this is something the game doesn't even tell you about. Most weapons and armor come with a penalty to magic power. Basically, the heavier the weapons and armor the character equips, the less effective their spells are going to be. Even weapons like staffs and daggers come with a penalty, and you can pretty much forget about wielding a sword, wearing heavy armor, or even holding a shield. This would be fine except for one major problem. There is no way to know this. Nowhere in the game can you see what impact a piece of equipment would have on the character's magic power. In fact, this penalty isn't even reflected in the character's stats. The only way to figure it out is by trial and error. This is a big problem. Great game design puts the player's fate in their own hands. No matter how brutal the challenge, no matter how steep the learning curve, a good game gives the player all the tools they need to succeed. And the most important tool is information. One of the cornerstones of interactive media, such as video games, is making meaningful choices. And choices are only meaningful, or in other words fun, when they are informed. Imagine being invited to play a game with your friends, but they won't tell you the rules. How can you even play? When the rules of the game aren't clearly conveyed to the player, it's a recipe for frustration. Final Fantasy II is full of such hidden pitfalls. The evasion attribute is really important in this game, since dodging attacks is generally a more reliable form of defense than armor. But the game doesn't tell you how to level evasion. It doesn't even tell you when it does increase. I went through the whole game never even knowing there was an evasion rank or magic defense. Something else the game doesn't tell you is how status effects impact attribute growth. Characters that end a battle with a status effect such as darkness, poison, or amnesia won't gain any attributes or skills, no matter what. That would have been nice to know. And there's more. Each character has a main hand. For example, Leon and Layla are lefties, but the game doesn't actually tell you this. Which kinda sucks, because if you accidentally equip your weapon in the wrong hand, the character suddenly won't do any damage. Good luck figuring out why. Oh, and don't ask me how dual wielding works. I've read multiple guides, but I still don't understand it. Final Fantasy II really could have used a tutorial, or at least a thicker manual. But even if you know everything there is to know about the game's progression system, it still doesn't solve the main problem. It just doesn't work very well. One does not simply play Final Fantasy II. The game must be conquered, and it's not always a pleasant process. Final Fantasy II can be extremely frustrating at times. There's a sort of janky feel to the game's balance, and the difficulty doesn't ramp up at a steady pace. One moment you're one-shotting monsters left and right. The next, you get demolished by a boss you can't even hurt. A lot of these issues came from the fact that the game's progression system honestly doesn't fit the gameplay all that well. There's just no natural progression to the character's growth, and the party won't get strong enough to tackle the game's dungeons and bosses just by playing in the game casually. To gain hit points, you obviously have to take damage, but the slow wear and tear you endure over multiple random encounters as you make your way through a dungeon doesn't count. You need to take a lot of damage in the same fight. Realistically, you need to lose at least half of your maximum hit points in a single encounter to have a solid shot at getting a boost. and that just doesn't happen very often. But it gets worse. The game doesn't actually care about how much damage you've taken. What it cares about is how much lower your hit points are at the end of the fight compared to when it began. So, if you heal your character during battle, you can say goodbye to that HP boost. Even so, leveling hit points is a breeze when compared with trying to raise the other resource your characters use in battle: magic points. Unlike its predecessor, Final Fantasy II uses MP to power spells, and it's a huge improvement. Instead, magic users in this game must face a new set of problems relating to MP. On the one hand, magic users will tend to be starved for MP. This is because the cost of spells increases relative to their rank. On the other hand, characters don't use enough MP in battle. Just like hit points, a character has a chance to increase their magic points if they lose enough of them in a single fight. The only problem is, again, you need to use up a lot of MP to have a real shot at an increase. Even if you cast your highest rank spells at every opportunity, chances are the battle will end before you can burn through your MP. And even if you can, would you really want to? You kinda need that MP for the rest of the dungeon. Burning through half of your MP in a single fight just isn't very feasible. Magic users face another problem relating to spells. As I said before, spells all have their own individual rank. But while fighters only really need to level 1 or 2 weapon types, magic users will want to master upwards of 5 to 10 spells, maybe more. And since you'll usually only get the chance to cast 1 or 2 spells per battle, this can be extremely time consuming. For example, Final Fantasy II introduced the Asuna spell, which will cure all of the various permanent status effects the game throws at your characters. But the way the spell is designed, what status effects you're able to cure will depend on the spell's rank. To cure the most dangerous status effects in the game, you'll need to have cast a spell at least 100 times, and probably twice that. Realistically, just by playing the game normally, you probably won't even get afflicted with status effects that often before beating the game. The original Final Fantasy could be tedious and grindy, but its random encounters were rewarding in the sense that they steadily and gradually increased your party's strength and survivability. Simply by going through the game's core gameplay loop of exploring the world and defeating random encounters, your party would naturally grow stronger. The irony is that even though Final Fantasy II is designed as a game where the characters grow as a natural consequence of their actions, this isn't actually the case. Attribute boosts from random encounters are too rare, and simply playing the game as you would any other JRPG isn't going to prepare your party for taking on the game's first few dungeons, let alone the horrors of Pandemonium. To really get anywhere in Final Fantasy II, you have to be more deliberate than that. You frequently have to take time off the grind. There is a jarring disconnect between the game's core gameplay and the progression system, and it honestly feels like you're constantly battling the game's clunky systems to get a chance to actually play the game. This is bad for the 3 heroes, but it gets even worse when combined with another of the game's key features: the rotating cast of companions. Welcoming a new companion into your party should be a blast. It's like making a new friend. Plus, there's the fun of learning their strengths and weaknesses, optimizing their equipment, and deciding what character build to go for. But Final Fantasy II's design really puts a damper on this experience. When 2 game design elements vibe together and build off of each other, we call that a synergy. Final Fantasy II's progression system and its companions are an example of the opposite, an anti-synergy. With the exception of Minwu, new companions generally join the party underpowered. Getting them up to speed with decent skills, hit points, and spell ranks is a lot of work. And since Final Fantasy II's progression system is contribution based, the irony is that weak characters tend to progress more slowly than strong characters. Catching new companions up to the 3 heroes takes dedication, but even if you're willing to go that extra mile, you're facing another problem. The companion isn't gonna stick around forever. Companions often leave abruptly, sometimes in the middle of a dungeon. And unless you're glancing at a guide as you play, you'll never see it coming. Sometimes companions return later in the story, but you won't know when or where. So whatever time you spend developing a companion may end up being time wasted. There's really something to be said for a traditional progression system with character levels, experience points equally distributed between party members, and a catch-up mechanic for lower level characters. It just works. Playing Final Fantasy II the honest way doesn't. But when things are broken, there's only one thing to do. You gotta cheese it. To put it lightly, Final Fantasy II's progression system is highly exploitable. There are two main reasons for this, and the first one is a bug. This was something many players ended up figuring out on their own. That is, the way the game calculates experience when your characters take actions in battle. Every time a character attacks or casts a spell, they gain experience with that weapon or spell. But the experience points aren't added when the character actually performs the attack or casts the spell. It's added when the player gives the command. Simply by cancelling the command and then repeating the process over and over, it was possible to quickly and effortlessly rack up tons of experience with weapons and spells. It's cheesy and tedious, but very effective. The other major exploit wasn't a bug, but came about as an unanticipated consequence of putting more power into the player's hands. Akitoshi Kawatsu thought that since the characters could be put to sleep by magic, it might be cool if the player was able to wake them up by hitting their own sleeping characters. For this reason alone, the possibility of targeting your own party members with attacks and harmful spells was added to the game. It didn't take long for players to get wise to how this could be exploited. See, when it comes to leveling hit points, it doesn't matter who does the damage. And compared to waiting for monsters to slowly wear the characters down in battle, having your own characters beat themselves up is lightning fast. The same is true for magic points. Leveling MP the honest way is brutal, but becomes absolutely trivial if you abuse spells like Sap, Swap, or Osmose. When combined, the progression system's flaws and exploits made for a very dangerous recipe. To explain why, we need to talk about player behavior. I often talk about how different choices in game design encourage different behaviors in the player, and how game designers can tweak their game systems to reward certain behaviors. As I've said before, there are three main ways to encourage a certain player behavior. You can make it fun, you can make it effective, or you can make it rewarding. Consciously or not, players will choose their actions according to some combination of these three factors. And when we look at Final Fantasy II's progression system, we have something of a lethal combination on our hands. First, as I've already outlined, playing the game as intended is neither effective nor fun, and the only way it could be considered rewarding is if you view surviving the game without cheesing as a personal challenge. Which, if you are, then more power to you. Secondly, exploiting the game's many bugs and design flaws to cheese your way to greatness is very effective, but it's still not fun. And this is probably the worst possible combination. Essentially, trying to beat the game without exploits is so frustrating that even the incredibly boring alternative of exploiting the progression system is more enjoyable. Really, what it comes down to is, when game designers fail to provide an enjoyable path, gamers will take the path of least resistance, even if it's boring. With all that said, if you enjoy power leveling, this game can be surprisingly fun. Final Fantasy II's progression system is so broken, once you figure out its inner workings, you can really go nuts. In the beginning, I kind of hated it. Towards the middle, I started to accept it. In the end, it became an obsession. It wasn't fun. Not really. It was more about stubbornness. I wanted to beat this game, so I started grinding, like a lot. I was looking up guides, reading up on the exact effect of different spells, and learning how to maximize the benefits of equipment. And by the time I reached Pandemonium, I wasn't content to just survive the final dungeon. I wanted to wreck it. In the end, it got to the point where I actually had to tear myself away from grinding to go and finish the game. Final Fantasy II's progression system had potential. I truly believe that with some solid playtesting, a few tweaks here and there, and better in-game documentation, this system could have been a winner. The later remakes of Final Fantasy II addressed these issues and made some much needed changes to the progression system, with the result that most of these frustrations from the original game have been eliminated. In fact, the improvements are so significant, you might as well be playing a different game, and a far more enjoyable one. Today, Final Fantasy II has a reputation as a broken game and a failed experiment. But this game deserves to be celebrated, because this is where the soul of Final Fantasy was born. Before I go on, I just want to say if you enjoyed this video, I'd be super grateful if you could hit the like button and leave a quick comment, as it really helps the video reach more people. And if you want to support me, consider subscribing to my channel, so I know people want to see more videos like this. The original Final Fantasy took a lot of inspiration from Ultima, Wizardry, and Dungeons & Dragons. In Final Fantasy II, the series started to take on its own identity. So much of what we've come to associate with Final Fantasy was first seen here. It's the first game to have named, predefined heroes, and the first to feature a rotating cast of playable characters. It's the first to center on a rebellion against an oppressive empire, and the first to include a Dark Knight and a Dragoon, arguably the most iconic Final Fantasy class. The game also introduced Cid, Leviathan, the Ultima spell, and Chocobos. And yes, as I hinted at near the beginning of this video, the classic Chocobo theme was first heard here too. The magic system saw a huge overhaul, with many of the spells from Dungeons & Dragons being dropped to make space for future Final Fantasy mainstays like Isuna, Toad, Berserk, Osmos, Shell, and Mini. Even the legendary Meteor spell first originated here, although only as a splashy special attack exclusive to the game's final boss. In terms of equipment, the Defender, Sunblade, Flamesword, and Icebrand are still here, courtesy of Dungeons & Dragons. But so are the Masamune and Excalibur, which were drawn from real-world history and myth. And Final Fantasy II also introduced several new pieces of gear that would stick around for a long time, including the Genji gloves, gold hairpin, and orichalcum. This game also launched some of the most common restorative items used throughout the series. The Ether, Elixir, and Phoenix Down all saw their first use in Final Fantasy II. But the biggest score for the game's identity came in its monster lineup. As I outlined in my video about Final Fantasy's Dungeons & Dragons roots, the original game's selection of enemies was almost exclusively grabbed from the monster manuals. Final Fantasy II did away with iconic Dungeons & Dragons properties like the Beholder, Mind Flayer, and Carrion Crawler. Instead, the game's dungeons were stocked with fresh, unique creations like the Morbol, Behemoth, and Quirrell. The list goes on, with many iconic Final Fantasy monsters making their first appearance in this game, including the Adamantoise, Gigantoad, Bomb, and Iron Giant. The sequel went a long way towards giving the series a distinctive identity. That it was able to do so speaks to one of the fundamental strengths of this game. With Final Fantasy II, Square were not afraid to experiment. It has been said that Final Fantasy II was not a good sequel, that it strayed too far from the established formula, that it changed too much, that it bore only a superficial resemblance to the first game. I disagree. Final Fantasy II resembles the original game in all the ways that matter. It was bold, unconventional, and extremely ambitious, and it established the very soul of Final Fantasy, innovation and risk-taking. In a word, courage. Final Fantasy II did a lot of things differently. Some worked out, some did not. Inventory management was a nightmare. The game balance was utterly broken. The progression system was clunky and primitive, but the ideas were ahead of their time. This is one of the earliest implementations of an activity-based progression system ever. This idea would later be used in Ultima Online, RuneScape, Dungeon Siege, and the Elder Scrolls. I'm not saying these games took inspiration from Final Fantasy II, I'm just saying that Final Fantasy II did it first. Although Final Fantasy never tried the same system again, elements from it made their way into some of the best games in the series, like Espers from Final Fantasy VI, Materia from Final Fantasy VII, and Junctions from Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy II's storytelling is primitive by today's standards, but its influence can be felt in everything Square has done since. It's the first game in the series that really put story front and center, and wanted to tell a more ambitious type of tale. Sure, it's a story that requires a lot of reading between the lines, but that also means it leaves space for the player to fill in with nuance and meaning. And when I started to think about what meaning I found in this game personally, I realized that, well, at the core, this is a story of sacrifice. The heroes of Final Fantasy II are literally willing to go to hell to stop the Emperor, but they are not alone. Joseph gave his life to repay the heroes for rescuing his daughter. Menu paid the ultimate price to give the rebel army a fighting chance. Prince Scott stayed behind so that the rebel army might escape, and even kept his love for Hilda a secret from her, so that she could move on when he was gone. But one character deserves above all others to be called a hero. Richard Highwind gave his life, his bloodline, and the entire legacy of the Dragoons to keep hope alive. At the heart of sacrifice lies courage. The courage to push on, even when the road is hard or the future uncertain. And the story of Final Fantasy II is a story of courage. not just in the game's narrative, but in its very creation. Following on the success of the first Final Fantasy, Square could have played it safe. Instead, they made sweeping changes to gameplay and tried telling a much more ambitious story. When asked what Final Fantasy meant to him, Hironobu Sakaguchi once said, "Way back then, the spirit was that we weren't making a product, but a creation. It was putting our soul into the production, pouring all of your ideas into the game, even if they crop up during development, not saving anything for the sequel." Final Fantasy II showed that Square were willing to innovate, try new things, and take risks. This is the soul of Final Fantasy. Time and time again, the series has reinvented established ideas, changed direction in terms of story or gameplay, and taken enormous risks. The mainline Final Fantasy series has always been a testing ground for new ideas and a realm of fearless imagination. There's never been a Final Fantasy that didn't stir up some drama among the fans. That's a good thing. The fact that no one can agree on which game is the best in the series shows how much Final Fantasy has to offer to so many different kinds of people. If these games had all followed the same basic formula set down in the original Final Fantasy, it wouldn't be the cultural phenomenon it is today. I struggled to get through this game, but now that I'm done, I'm left with a feeling of great affection for Final Fantasy II, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. And it's become clear to me that there is something that needs to be said. Akitoshi Kawatsu was the creative mind behind many of Final Fantasy II's unfortunate design choices, for which he's received a lot of criticism over the years. After Final Fantasy II, Kawatsu left the Final Fantasy team to work on the Saga series. Many years later, when asked what he thought would have become of Final Fantasy if he'd stayed on the series, he said, "It wouldn't be as popular as it is." Nothing could be further from the truth. Final Fantasy II may have been an experiment that didn't work out, but its legacy of courage and innovation lives and breathes in every fiber of the Final Fantasy series. For that, every single one of us who ever loved Final Fantasy owes a huge debt of gratitude to Akitoshi Kawatsu. Kawatsu-sensei, hontou ni arigatou gozaimasu. The message I take away from Final Fantasy II is this: celebrate innovation, celebrate risk-taking and new ideas, even if they don't work out. The current media landscape is dominated by the safe and the comfortable. Sequels, remakes, and reboots. By all means, criticize greed, false advertisement, and outright lies, but don't criticize honest attempts at innovation. Celebrate game designers who dare to dream. There's no shame in failing, only in never daring to try in the first place. Now, I promised I would show you the game's most powerful spell. This is a legendary tome of such tremendous potential, even its creators feared its true power. That spell is, of course, Toad. Toad is not to be trifled with. This spell is nuts. When used against enemies, they literally croak. And Toad is more than likely the strongest instant kill spell in all of Final Fantasy. Once you get it to a decent rank, it will work on just about anything, with nearly 100% success rate. Really, the only thing it doesn't work on is the final boss. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.